Hello, my friends. How are you today? Once again, it is I, Miss Surrett, here to talk to you about how the United States was building an empire of influence. And the big question we're going to think about today is how was the United States involved in Latin America at the turn of the 20th century? So again, we're still talking about that time period between the 1800s to the 1900s. Now I'm going to talk to you today about three presidents, and I'm going to pull up my laser pointer. There we go. And talk to you today about Theodore Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1909, William Howard Taft, president from 1909 to 1913, and Woodrow Wilson, president from 1913 to 1921. Now, for any of my astute scholars out there who have noticed that presidential elections seem to happen in even years, just so you know, the president is actually elected in the even year but begins his service in the odd year, which explains why we have 1901 instead of 1900. It's a little confusing. I'm going to start by talking about our friend Theodore Roosevelt, who was actually known as the Peacemaker, although very interesting guy. He was a Harvard graduate. He was also a cowboy, and he was an avid outdoorsman. So he was a big proponent for national parks. In fact, the National Park Services really took off under him. But at the same time, he was also a believer in big business, well, not big business, excuse me, in negotiations, and he was very rough and tumble. That was kind of his big feature. If you've ever seen the movie Night at the Museum, I think it is, where they're at the Smithsonian, you can see that aspect of him demonstrated very vividly. He was a major reason for the building of the Panama Canal, which I'll get into in a moment. And the thing about Roosevelt is he doesn't want the Europeans to control the world economy or politics. He really wants the United States to get in there and get their share. So this is where the United States is going to really expand their influence. Now you'll remember our friend the Monroe Doctrine, which we talked about earlier. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how Roosevelt used the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt didn't want European intervention in Latin America, especially because Latin America had taken some loans from European countries and were now defaulting on these loans. So he wants to keep the Europeans out as much as possible. He really wants to make the United States the big dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America. So he goes to the Europeans and he says to them, hey, remember, we've got the Monroe Doctrine. You'd better stay out. You know, you stay on your side, we stay on our side. Remember, we saw those comics. And as we mentioned before, the Monroe Doctrine demands that the European countries really stay out of Latin American affairs. But Roosevelt goes a step further. He adds what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. Gee, what a surprising name, right? To the Monroe Doctrine. And he says that if Latin America is in chaos or disarray, it's going to really force the United States to exercise international police power. So basically he's saying, look, if you go in there and you cause chaos, Europe, we're going to have to come after you. And so it's more than just us saying, hey, no, you stay over there. Now it's us saying, not only are we going to come after you there, we're going to come after you wherever we need to. So the United States is basically saying, we're going to use force, whatever it takes to protect our economic interests in Latin America. You stay out, we're going to stay in. And here you have a picture. His famous statement was walk softly and carry a big stick. And you can see him here. He's protecting the Caribbean. Here's Panama, here's Mexico, Santo Domingo, Cuba, various countries in the Caribbean. And here he is with his big stick, and he's protecting, and he's telling the Europeans, we're here, we're going to protect this area. During this time period, we see a big change in trying to figure out how to get our goods from one location to another. One of the biggest issues, it seems sort of silly these days, but at the time was how do we get all the way from New York to San Francisco? And of course we have the Transcontinental Railroad, but some items are easier shipped by sea. And so if you're using the Transcontinental Railroad, you're not going to be able to get your items where they need to be. So to get from the East Coast, say New York or Savannah or any place, all the way around to the West Coast took 15,000 miles. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see down here, but 15,000 miles. That was a long time, guys. That was months. If you wanted to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, it took you months to get there. So this is a time period when the president and others become interested in figuring out how can we get from point A to point B in the fastest possible way without going all the way down to the bottom of South America and back up again. And we enter the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was a project. They looked here at this little isthmus, which is a small, narrow land strip connecting two larger land strips, and they said, how could we maybe turn this into an advantage for ourselves? And they realized it's pretty narrow. I mean, we could just cut right through it and connect the Atlantic with the Pacific. And this is going to take us just 5,000 miles. It's like a third of the trip, instead of taking 15,000 miles to go all the way down. So the idea of the Panama Canal was very appealing to the President Roosevelt and to business interests in the United States. But it wasn't exactly easy to get started. For one thing, Panama was in a tough situation. Colombia was actually waging war with it. Panama was a colony of Colombia. And so the United States goes in and says to Colombia, okay, look, let's figure out a way to fix this. Let's see if there's a way we can build this canal. It's going to not only help us, it's going to help everybody. You know, you could use it to get across. But it doesn't really go very well. Colombia is not really in the mood to negotiate. And there's a French company that's been in Panama trying to figure out how to build this for a while. So they decide to organize a Panamanian rebellion. If they can rebel against the Colombians, they can kick the Colombians out, and then the French company can go in and build. And the United States says, whoa, good idea. I'll tell you what, you go in there and organize this rebellion. We'll give you military, we'll give you assistance, we'll help you defeat Colombia. And of course, now Panama is going to be so grateful to the United States that they're going to allow the United States to build the Panama Canal. So this works. They sign a treaty and the United States pays $10 million for the canal zone. Now that's just for that strip of land. Of course, they pay a lot more to try and build the land, and there's so many difficulties. First of all, this is a humongous feat of engineering. It's not like the Pacific and the Atlantic are just even and they just go across like this. They've got to be able to get a boat this direction, but then they've got to be able to figure out how to get a boat back this direction. Otherwise, it's useless. I mean, what's the point of being able to go from New York to San Francisco, but you can't go from San Francisco to New York? So this is an amazing engineering feat that I'll talk about in a moment. But one of the worst things about it was the difficulty for the workers. The geographic obstacles, the terrain was very treacherous. I mean, you look at this narrow piece of land, you think, how hard can this be? But you're talking swamps, you're talking mountains. Plus, you're talking diseases that most of the workers were very unfamiliar with, so they succumbed. A lot died. But they did have over 43,000 workers employed at one time, which gave people options for jobs, both from the United States, Latin America, France, you name it. And as you can see here, I mentioned some mountains. You can see it kind of devolves into swamp as you keep going. This was not easy geography to build in, and they've got to bring their supplies in. They kind of hastily construct sort of these boards to get over the mud. But they are successful eventually in opening the Panama Canal, and it is a huge feat of engineering. And it's actually pretty cool. You can take tours that'll take you from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it takes about my parents actually went on a tour not too long ago, and they said it takes about 24 hours to get through the canal just because you have to wait in line with the boats and stuff like that. Here's some pictures of it today, and as you can see right here, I think this is such a neat design. These are doors called locks, and what they will do is they will let the boat go in part way, they will close one part of the lock, and they will open another so they can pump water in and out. So they can raise the boat so it can get through, or they can lower the boat depending on which side it's going to, because it's actually not quite even. I mean, that makes sense with all the mountains and everything you've got here. So here you see some boats coming out, and the other boats are kind of lined up. If you imagine that there's more water over here. The other boats are kind of lined up to the side, and so they go in through one way, and then the next day they go out the other way. So that's why it can take 24 hours to get through. But there's a really neat 1-minute video that you can look at that tells you a little bit about how the Panama Canal works, and it is amazing, guys. Just amazing what they could do. All right. I'm going to mention briefly 2 other presidents. The first is William Howard Taft. And Taft came after Roosevelt, and he believed we don't really need military intervention, kind of like where Roosevelt was going. Instead, let's use business deals. Let's expand our influence through business deals. And he encouraged something in China called the open door policy. Not only would the Americans build major railroads, but let's have the Europeans come involved. Let's let everybody be involved in this so we can all work together. So the idea that, you will accept my influence because I'm nice to you. If I come in and I say nice things to you, and then I say, hey, what if you tried this or that? You're more likely to listen to me than if I walked in and I said, dude, seriously, that's what you're going to do. Now, at the same time in Latin America, you have the Nicaraguan government who was very pro-American at this time. But they were facing a revolution, and he did send the Marines in to help stop that revolution so that the United States could continue to get access to Nicaragua and therefore Panama, because they're right next door to each other. So you see that even though he wants to use business deals, he will use military when necessary. The other guy I'm going to mention is Woodrow Wilson. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Woodrow Wilson, but today I'm just going to mention what he did in Latin America. He was president at the beginning of World War I. And he believed that the American influence could bring freedom, democracy, and peace to the world. So he believed in the idea of spreading American ideals. In Latin America, he wasn't real pleased with several of the Mexican presidents. He felt that they were being tyrants and they were treating their people very unfairly, so he did fight with them. He even at one point seized the port of Veracruz to kind of make his point. He sponsored elections in the Dominican Republic to help them set up a democratic government to kind of get rid of the Spanish and set up their own government. And he did have to send troops in to do it. He also sent troops into Haiti to maintain order. So he was not afraid of sending troops where they needed to go to protect American interests. All right, guys, so that talks a little bit about the expansion of American influence, especially into Latin America. And you can see how we are growing again, as I mentioned before in the other recording, we're growing from an isolation policy to an imperialism policy where we are willing to get more involved in the outside world. All right, my friends, that does it for this recording. Let me know if you have any questions.